Hey everyone, in today's video we are going to continue to dive into the writing rope. Now this is video number 2 in a series that I am making where we are looking at Joan Sedita's The Writing Rope. She has identified 5 different strands of writing. When they are all taught together and kind of woven together, we get skilled writing. So in this series I am taking all 5 strands and I am talking about them specifically in grades K through 2. So what might those skills look like in kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade? Just as a quick background, I first uploaded this video right here, which is a brief overview of the writing rope in general, and I kind of quickly dive into each of the 5 strands. And then for this series, I really wanted to start off with the transcription strand. So the last video I made is this one right here, where we talk about spelling strategies and handwriting strategies in grades K through 2. In today's video, we are going to go to the top of the writing rope and we are going to talk about critical thinking. Now in this strand, you can see we will be talking about generating ideas and gathering information, as well as teaching about that writing process, thinking, planning, writing, and revising. So we will go a little bit into building background knowledge for our students, and then I'm going to walk through each part of the writing process and share some tips and strategies for kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade learners. If you are ready to dive into this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's just get started. All right, before we go into each part of the writing process and why and how we should teach it in a K through 2 classroom, let's talk about generating ideas and building background knowledge. We know that writing places heavy demands on both executive functions and working memory within our students because, as I've talked about numerous times, there are so many different things our brains need to be able to do in order to write something on paper. Many different things. So what we can do for our students is we can help lessen that load by really spending a lot of time brainstorming and planning our writing before we write. In fact, many different researchers agree that we should spend more time brainstorming and planning our writing than we actually do drafting or writing our piece. And that's because we can, again, kind of lower that cognitive load by thinking of the idea, planning it out in a meaningful way, and then once we have it already planned, we're basically just taking those ideas and refining them by copying them over on paper. So the planning part we'll get to when we talk about the writing process, but in terms of generating ideas, I often get asked the question, what do I do when my students say they have nothing to write about? I feel like that's probably pretty common, but especially in kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade, I have teachers ask me all the time, they'll be like, I have a bunch of students, they just look at me and they say, I have nothing to write. I can't think of anything. And there's 2 main strategies I use to kind of help students through that process. They're both more of procedures actually than strategies, but during every writing lesson, and I've shared this before, I always do some explicit teaching and then some modeling, right? During that I do part where I am teaching students how to do something, I also model exactly how to do that. And that includes the brainstorming process. So when I am thinking of ideas within some sort of genre that we are writing, if for example, we are learning personal narratives, I will think aloud and brainstorm many different ideas. And as a quick side note, when you're brainstorming those ideas, make sure they're relevant to the students in front of you. I live up here in Massachusetts. We are very close to beaches. So I always use the example of, oh, I went to the beach and then this is what I did. My students are familiar with the beach. Many of them have been there before. In fact, many of them have gone there on a field trip the year before. So I know that my students know how to do this. If you don't live near a beach, probably don't use that example. So first, you always want to model thinking aloud and providing many different ideas that, sure, some of your students might steal. They might say, hey, okay, I also went to the beach. I can't think of anything else right now. I'm going to write about that. That's okay. They need to write about their time at the beach and we can refine that later. But if they steal my brainstorming idea, I'm totally fine with that. But I'm not just going to give them one. In fact, I'm going to brainstorm at least 4 or 5 different ideas, and then I will even continue my think aloud by choosing one of them to write about. So modeling is the first procedure you never want to skip. The second procedure I always have students do, and this really cuts down on the amount of students that say they have nothing to write about, is I always have my students share what they're going to write before they leave the rug. So during my writing block, I have students come over to the carpet. This is again where I'm doing that explicit teaching, that modeling, and then I tell students, okay, we're gonna go back to our seats and you are going to brainstorm or come up with some ideas of something you can write about. Before we leave, I want you to close your eyes and think about something you might want to write about. And then again, this is based on the genre. So if we're talking about personal narratives, I might walk them through a little visualization exercise where I say, close your eyes and think about what you did yesterday when you woke up in the morning. Think about what you did on the weekend. Like I might walk them through a few of these steps just to get their brains working for about a minute. And then before they leave the rug, I have them turn and talk to somebody on the carpet and tell them what are 1 or 2 ideas that you're going to add to your brainstorming map. This way students have heard and watched me go through a think aloud, come up with some ideas. Now they get to hear from a partner or somebody else on the rug about what their idea is. And then as they gather those ideas and as they say something aloud, I know students have something to write about when they go back. As soon as I hear most of my students share some ideas, I give them their paper and I tell them they can go head back to their seat and get started. If I hear students that are either silent or are verbally saying, I don't know, I'm not sure, I didn't do that, I don't want to write about that, then I leave those, and it's usually only 1 or 2 students at that point. I leave them on the carpet with me, so that way I've kind of like released everybody else. They can go start their writing because they already shared an idea or 2, so they know what they're doing. And then I can work with those students one-on-one. And when it comes down to that point, I basically ask them some direct questions about what they did, what they're interested in, what we can write about, and I pretty much just give them idea based on what they're telling me and say, okay, go. Go add those to your brainstorming. And then through a quick little conversation, I will point out a few different ideas for them. And I'm like, great, you can talk about this, this, and this. Go back to your seat, add those to your brainstorming sheet. So for idea generation, don't forget to do explicit modeling and always have your students verbally share what they're going to go write about before they leave the carpet. And just as a side note, that tip goes for every lesson that I do. So if we were doing a direct lesson on adding conjunctions or adding labels to our picture, I would again still have students turn and talk to someone and practice doing something with their oral language before they go back and write. Beyond idea generation, we also need to think about our students' background knowledge. Every time we ask students to complete a writing task, we need to ask ourselves as teachers, what tools do my students need to have and what information do my students need to know to complete this task? Now there's plenty of background knowledge our students need to know in terms of writing. For example, they need to know how to form the letters. They need to know how to spell the words. Within each different writing genre, there's a different text structure that they need to know, and we'll talk about that in our text structure video. But for this purpose, I want to talk about content knowledge, content background knowledge. What do we need to build up for our students to write a successful piece? Now, many times in K-2 classrooms, you will see a heart map, which is a wonderful place to start. It just basically gets students thinking of ideas and lets them know that they can write about anything. It's kind of this open-ended brainstorming map that we have for our students. And while that is a wonderful place to start, I don't like to just make a heart map at the beginning of the year and kind of rely on that all year, right? I will use a different brainstorming activity, a different brainstorming think aloud, a different brainstorming organizer for every genre unit that I teach. In the SJT Writing Club, I have a ton of different genre-based units, and always on day 1 or day 2, we spend some time brainstorming different ideas that we could write about within each genre. So again, I will have taught students what that genre kind of looks like. So if we are going to be writing reviews, for example, I won't have my students just pull out their heart map that they made, the first couple weeks of school and choose something there to review. No, we do an entire new brainstorming activity where we think about specific things we can review based on some explicit teaching I already taught them. I may have already read them some book reviews. I love to read them video game reviews off like GameStop.com. Because, kids love video games, again, find what they're interested in, and I like to read them real reviews that people have written. I also like to go on Target or Amazon and find reviews for like really cool toys for your students' age range. Again, you want to make it enticing for them, you want to make it relatable, and you want them to see that they can review these different things. After that, we will get our own brainstorming sheet where I will first, of course, model thinking aloud all these different things I can review, and then I have them, share with one another what are 1 or 2 things you could review, and then they go off and complete that brainstorming sheet themselves. So we always walk through that process for each different genre that I'm teaching. Now that all works within genre-based writing, but if we are writing within subjects, which is something I really want to focus on more next year, and making sure that I am connecting what we're learning in social studies, in science, in reading, and connecting it to our writing, I also have to think about that background knowledge as well. We know that we can teach our students to learn to write, and we can also teach our students to write to learn. And when we can have our students write down what they're learning, it is a great and effective way for students to process what they're learning. So when we're talking about building background knowledge while integrating writing with other subjects, we can do this a few different ways. We can build background knowledge through read-alouds, of course. That's going to be a pretty typical way we do it in K-2. We can also show some videos. We can find different texts about the same subject and compare them. And then we can make purposeful writing prompts to make sure our students are processing that information. For example, in first grade, we often teach about community helpers. So after reading books and watching videos and learning about different community helpers in our neighborhood, I might ask my students to choose a community helper and share 3 ways they help your local community. So here I'm giving students a prompt, but I'm also giving them some freedom to choose any of the community learners we have learned about. And then I'm asking them to share some information, right? They're going to write an informative piece about that community helper and some different ways that they help the community. And I might say, think about the community helpers we've learned. Whose job do you think is the hardest? And provide 2 reasons why you think that. Using all the same background knowledge, I could also ask students to do a narrative type writing. I might say, choose a community helper and tell me what a typical day in their life might look like. So they would have to tell me a beginning, a middle, and an end. Again, following those text structures that our students will have learned about, but integrating it with what we're learning in other subject areas. Okay, so those were some ideas and strategies for idea generation, as well as building background knowledge. Now let's quickly walk through the writing process. When we're thinking about the writing process, we are thinking about the steps we need to take to go from idea down to a published piece of writing. And now, while it may sound linear, we know that it's actually much more of a circular process where we are going to come up with an idea, we might want to plan it out, we write a little bit, we revise, maybe we have a new idea, we kind of go back all around, and basically a piece of writing is almost never finished, which sounds a little discouraging. But it's all part of the writing process, and it's a process we want our students to be familiar with. Now, there are many different takes on the writing process and which exact steps you want to include based on your students. I shared this in my first writing rope video, but I want to share these free writing process posters with you. Here is what they look like. I originally made these for the SJT Writing Club for them to go ahead and display somewhere in their classroom when they're teaching about writing. So I chose 5 different posters, and you'll see what they include. First, we have think. I can think of an idea to share. Then my second step, I have plan and say. It says I can take my idea and plan what I want to share. Now, I also include there a little picture of a graphic organizer because we're going to rely heavily on those. And then I also have a little speech bubble because, again, as I always say, oral language precedes written language, and it's a very important part in our K-2 classroom. Then we go to draw and write. A lot of times it'll just say write, but we also know in K-2 drawing is a big part of our storytelling, so I wanted to include that. Then we have edit and revise. I chose to put these on one poster in K-2 because essentially what I want students to recognize is that after we write something, we must go back into it to reread our writing, add things to it, fix things, and just kind of give it a once over. Some people end after the revision stage, but I always add this 5th poster in where we say share. I can share my story with you all. Sharing is vitally important in K-2 classrooms. We will definitely talk about this more in a later video, but when we ask students to write for authentic audiences and actually have reasons and understanding about why we're writing, it makes their writing so much better. So I always make sure that we praise our writing in all sorts of ways. I will link all those posters down in the description in case you want to add them to your classroom this year, but let's quickly walk through each of those steps and see what that would look like in K-2. The first one here, think. I can think of an idea and share. We basically just spent the whole first half of this video talking about idea generation and brainstorming, so we're going to move on to plan and say. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, idea generation and planning is actually going to take up a big bulk of our writing. And that's again because this is where we can really do that heavy lifting for our students. That way, if we can plan everything out the way we want it to be written and teach different text structures within this planning period, then the writing part becomes much simpler. When we think about planning, it's going to be very important that we use some sort of visual planning sheet for our students to organize their ideas. And basically this means we need them to have a graphic organizer. But it's even more important that the graphic organizer is going to match the text structure of what we're teaching. If, for example, we're teaching our students how to write a narrative, our organizer we probably want to follow in some sequential order, because in K-2 we want our students to understand that a narrative has a beginning, a middle, and an end. If we're teaching our students how to write an informative piece, we want that organizer to have some place where we introduce our topic. Depending on the grade level, we might have a topic sentence that we want them to plan out. And then we have 1, 2, 3, again, depending on the grade level, kind of facts that are going to support that topic or tell us more about that topic. And the same with opinion writing. We know that we want our students to introduce their opinion right at the beginning, and then we want them to give some reasons to support their opinion. Just for some quick examples that I can show you, I pulled these from the SJT Writing Club. I explained this earlier, but the SJT Writing Club is my writing membership where I have tons of different genre writing units. I have story-based writing units that are based on different picture books. I have seasonal writing units. We have, grammar, punctuation. We've got everything in there. But just for some quick examples so you can see what I'm talking about, I pulled the personal narrative graphic organizer, the informative writing graphic organizer, and the opinion booklet graphic organizer. So here is the one I like to use for personal narratives. I have shared this one so many times before, but it is called Say It, Then Sketch It. I have this one completely free that I will link down below for you to grab. But essentially what I want my students to do is tell someone your story first, then sketch it below. So I have my students go back to their seats. Of course, I have explicitly modeled how to do this first. Just pointing that out. So now students have gone back to their seats and they are going to tell someone their story first and then sketch it below. So they will do this step by step. So with the person sitting next to them, they will say first, and then they'll tell the first part of their story. Again, we've already brainstormed what idea they're going to write about, what part in their life, something that really happened, and so on. So they'll say first, they both share it, and then they go ahead and sketch it below. Then they look at each other and they say, okay, next, or then they draw it below, and then finally, and then they draw it in the last box. Now, because I usually teach personal narratives at the beginning of the year, I largely rely on oral language, so saying our story, and then sketching. And I write sketch instead of draw because I, again, in the explicit modeling part, explain that we are not spending forever kind of, drawing this beautiful illustration. We're quickly sketching something out. We're using stick figures. We're kind of just showing little objects here and there to explain what's happening in that part of the story. And what this is doing is allowing those ideas to kind of take up all that brain space. It's kind of taking them out one by one. And we are saying again that sentence aloud. We're drawing a quick sketch so we can remember each part of the story. And we're doing that for the beginning, the middle, and then the end. And then of course, when we get to step 3, which is our drawing and writing, I explicitly show students how to take each part of that planning sheet and create a sentence for each one over on their booklet. Here's an example of the planning my opinion sheet. I have them put their name up there, and then based on grade level, since my club is for kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade, I have a space for students to write their opinion, and then I have a space for them to share 1 reason, 2 reasons, or 3 reasons to support their opinion. I also didn't write lines there, which I know might drive some teachers a little crazy, but I do that on purpose because for the planning purposes in K through 2, sometimes our students don't have a direct sentence that they want to write just yet. So this gives them the opportunity to sketch in those boxes, but many of my students, especially after the personal narrative unit, they will go right to writing their sentence. They will, just on their own, they will go ahead and write down. And I will, of course, model how to do that too. I'll show them that exact sheet. I'll say, oh, I could sketch here. I can just draw a sketch like we did in personal narratives. Or I might already have an idea of the sentence I want to write, and I'm going to write it in the box. I hope you're seeing here that explicit instruction is going to be necessary in every single step of this process. And then for the informative writing planning sheet, we have my topic. This is just going to be 1 word. We have a whole space for a topic sentence because when we get to this point of writing, I will have explicitly taught them what a topic sentence should look like, and then they will go and plan that. That'll probably be 1 whole day of talking about topic sentences, coming up with different ones, brainstorming different ones, modeling different ones, and then having them go write theirs. And then again, there's spots for a different amount of facts based on the grade level. The most important part during this planning and saying process is that you want to make sure that what you're having students plan to write aligns with what they should be writing. So again, If you're going to be spending all this time planning, make sure in first grade you're teaching students to really state their opinion right away and then provide 1 or 2 reasons to support that opinion. Make it visual for them, have boxes there for them to write or draw in. It's going to make the process so much easier for when we get to step 3. Step 3 is our draw and write stage. Now, I mentioned this during the planning part, but essentially for every single genre unit that I write, after we walk through the planning process, I explicitly teach my students how to take that planning sheet and turn it into writing. Just like we shouldn't assume that our students naturally have ideas for writing informative texts, we shouldn't assume that our students know how to plan an informative writing piece, and we definitely shouldn't assume that they know how to take a planning sheet and just turn it into writing. Even though it seems very obvious, we want to explicitly teach every step of the way. Now, I personally, when teaching writing in K through 2, I like to have them turn their planning sheet into mini booklets. So I will actually have loose leaf paper. It looks like this right here. I have all different options. Some have more lines, some have bigger dotted lines, some have less dotted lines. Sometimes the picture box is bigger. Endless options. But I have students use those sheets, and what they'll do is for the say and sketch sheet, this one right here, for example, that we did in personal narratives, if they have 3 different steps, I will have them grab 3 different sheets of paper based on each step. If we are writing informative text, we have a topic sentence, so I will actually have them take a whole piece of paper for that topic sentence page, and then if they have 2 different facts, we will grab 2 other fact sheets, and again, we're making like our own mini book. I like to do this for 3 different reasons. First and foremost, when we take our writing and our planning sheet and we get to turn it into like a booklet, it just makes it feel much more like we're publishing a book, like we're a real author. The second reason I like it is because it allows us to add more to our stories, because we will again first start with that planning sheet. Usually there's only 1 sentence in each one, especially in K and 1. So we will take that 1 sentence and copy that 1 sentence onto each page. Then when we get to our revision stages, it's much easier to go back into those pages and add more because there's so much space for them to write more. And lastly, I also find that it's much easier to edit. Sometimes if we have 1 whole page and there's a bunch of sentences, students have a really hard time thinking, okay, I needed to add a word in here. How am I going to add this? It's going to ruin the whole page. Even though we teach them, doing a little caret, crossing out, it's totally fine. When they have different pages that they can go, there's just much more room for them to erase, add more, so on and so forth. So I personally always love taking the planning sheet and turning that into anywhere between 3 and 4 pages based on what we need our students to write. Then when it comes to the drawing portion, each page is going to have its own drawing to match what the words say. I also teach my students all the time that the pictures are the story. Especially in K through 2, our students can actually tell us so much more in the illustration than they might be able to get down on the page. And then when we add more to the illustration, we might have another sentence we want to write. And then if we write something down here, we might have something we can add to the illustration. It goes in this circular process. In K through 2 with illustrations, I always talk about labels. We talk about adding backgrounds and settings. We talk about adding thought bubbles and speech bubbles. And I always do a lesson on how to add emotion to our characters' faces. Again, any information they can add to the illustration is going to give the reader so much more information, and it also can give them ideas that they can write about as well. So that's why I always include writing and drawing as 1 step in this process. Moving right along to our 4th step, which is edit and revise. This is the step where we really want our students to focus on rereading their writing. We need to make sure that after they go ahead and plan it and spend all this time coming with the idea, planning it out and writing it down, that they recognize that their process is not over, right? Which it can be a hard pill to swallow for some of them. But after they write it, we need to be like, wait a sec, we have to go back. We have to reread it. We have to see what we can add, what we can change. And I keep saying rereading because that is going to be an important part of this process for them. I want my students to read their stories aloud. They can whisper read it to themselves, but when we read our stories out loud instead of in our head, we pick up on many more errors than we do if we read it silently. Often when we read it in our heads, our brain kind of fills in missing words and what we know it was supposed to say instead of what it actually says. But when we take the step to say it out loud, we can actually hear what the words on the paper say and what we might need to change. For editing, I like to keep it pretty simple. I have my own editing checklists within the SJT Writing Club, but I also created this cups checklist a few weeks ago that I gave for free, so I will link this down in the description for you to grab. Basically, you just want your students to go through the basics of what you've taught them, right? For any sort of editing or revision checklist, you will still need to make sure it aligns to what you taught your students to do. The same way you want to make sure that your planning sheet aligns with what type of writing they're going to be doing. Now, when it comes to revision in K through 2, I want my students to go back and make sure that they have included the essential parts of that type of writing. And I like to do this through a publishing checklist. So this is kind of their final step before they say that they are done. They need to make sure that the lessons I've taught them, that they've incorporated some of these things into their writing. And like I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure this aligns with what you taught them. That's why I made them in the SJT Writing Club to go along with the exact lessons that I taught my students within each genre. So for example, this is the publishing checklist for personal narratives, and students need to walk through this. Again, we usually walk through this together. I, of course, explicitly model how to do this with my own writing. Is my personal narrative a story about something that happened to me? If so, they can give it a check. Is my personal narrative focused on a small moment? Give it a check. Does my personal narrative have a clear beginning, middle, and end? Did I use transition words? Did I add character dialogue, thoughts, feelings, and or actions? These are all different mini lessons that I did with my students, and so they don't need to have all of them, but did they try to add at least one of them in there? And then I always have, did I go through my editing checklist? And then at the end, when it says you're ready to publish this work, it's almost done, you still need to check, okay, do I have detailed, colorful illustrations? And is my handwriting the neatest I can make it? The editing checklist, the illustrations, and the handwriting will be on all of my revision checklists, but then what steps are on the checklist are going to be very genre-based. So here's another example for opinion writing based on the lessons that I taught in that unit. Did I clearly state my opinion at the beginning? Did I provide at least one reason to support my opinion? Did I include any linking words to make my reasons more detailed? And because also, did I add a conclusion to my opinion booklet? And then here is one for informative writing. Do I have a topic sentence? Do I share facts, I put in parentheses, not opinions, about my topic? Do my illustrations have some clear labels? Do my captions share more information? And did I add a closing to my informative mini book? As you can see with each of those different checklists, those are lessons that I had my students go back in after we've taken our initial planning sheet and turned it into writing. I gave them a lesson on, okay, here's what a caption is. Let's go back into our writing and see if we can add them. And then again, kind of have my students experiment there by adding more. And then when we go through the checklist, they need to see if they have done that. There are many different lessons and techniques and different things you might want to have your students try to do within each writing genre, and that's totally fine. You just want to make sure that as they go back into their story and they try to add more and revise it based on the lessons you're teaching them, that you have some way of kind of making sure they're doing that. And I like to do that through a visual checklist. And last but not least, step number 5 is sharing. Now, I hope you can see that again, it's not always a perfectly circular type thing, this writing process, because sharing is used quite often. I talked about it in Plan and Say. We talk about sharing during brainstorming. We share our ideas all the time. But then also when we talk about sharing, I want to talk about celebrating our writing and what we've added to our writing. I think I said this earlier, but writing is an inherently social thing. So we want to make sure that we are communicating with one another. We want to really celebrate the work that we're doing. It really increases student motivation, and we can do this many different ways. First and foremost, every single day, my students will have an opportunity to talk about their writing in some fashion. Like I said, we'll usually do this before we actually leave the carpet. We will have students turn and talk to one another, share what they're going to add to their story, and go back and do it at their seats. Sometimes I will have students actually share at their seats while they're writing, but then at the end of every lesson, I always have kind of a wrap up where I will either myself highlight something that I saw students do, and of course you want to highlight a wide range of abilities. You don't just want to highlight, an exemplary piece. We do want to share that often so students know what that looks like, kind of what the goal is going to be there, but we also want to make sure we highlight perseverance. We want to make sure we highlight each step of that writing process. If a student was really struggling to come up with an idea and they finally come up with one even by the end of that writing block, that might be something to highlight. Hey, I am so proud of XYZ. You know, it was really hard to come up with an idea, but now would you like to share what your idea is with the class? That's gonna be great. I can't wait to hear more. Now, while I will definitely point out stuff all the time, I also wanna make sure that I'm not the only one, you know, choosing what to point out and what to praise. So very often I will simply ask students to take a look at their writing and to share with someone at their table, someone sitting next to them, share with them what they're proud of, what they added. It could be something they added to their illustrations, a sentence that they added. It could be a thought bubble that they added. Anything that they added, I want them to share it with their partner. Not only, again, does it increase motivation, but it also lets them know someone else is going to be reading their writing, or they're going to be sharing it with someone else as well. It kind of gives them a little bit more ownership behind their writing. All right, so I think that gives you a good look at the critical thinking strand and what that might look like in a K-2 classroom. We talked a lot about idea generation and brainstorming because, again, in K-2, we really need to start with an idea. Our students need to know that they are capable of writing about many different things. Then we need our students to recognize that writing is a process that they walk through, and in each stage of the process, we need to heavily rely on explicit teaching and modeling before our students go off and do this themselves. I shared different planning organizers, what my revision checklist kind of look like. I shared a free editing checklist, and I have those free writing posters for you as well. So make sure you check out the description down below to grab anything that was mentioned in this video. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Next week, we will be talking about the syntax strand. So we're really going to dive into sentence construction. Very excited about that one. If you did enjoy this video, give it a like. Be sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.